In this lecture, we'll be looking at the battle at Actium and the aftermath of the battle. We'll begin by looking at the disintegration of the alliance between Octavian and Antony, ending in their confrontation at Actium and the eventual suicides of Antony and Cleopatra, and then look at the emergence of Octavian as the victor and sole ruler of the Roman Empire. So in 34 BC, Antony does something highly unusual and ill-advised, and this is called the Donations of Alexandria. So he had won a great military victory over the Armenians, and back in Alexandria, he stages a Roman-style triumph for himself. And as part of the celebration, he delivers a speech in which he does a number of different things, but perhaps most startling, he distributes several different eastern lands that are in fact Roman territories. They're not Antony's own playground, but distributes this land to Cleopatra, Cleopatra's son by Caesar, Ptolemy Caesar, as well as his own 3 children by Cleopatra. So in essence, giving Roman territory to the children of Cleopatra. And this is called the Donations of Alexandria. It's also during this time that he declares that Caesarion, that is, whose other name is Ptolemy Caesar, these are the same people, declares Caesarion as the legitimate heir of Caesar. And this is a very deliberate move that again shows the hostility that has developed between Antony and Octavian. So Octavian, remember, is the adopted heir of Caesar and makes much of the fact that he is the legitimate descendant of Caesar. Well, by Antony declaring Caesarion as the legitimate heir, it sets up Caesarion as a rival to Octavian. And in fact, Caesarion has direct blood from Caesar. He's the biological child. So this is a potential threat to Octavian, and Octavian recognizes it as such. Octavian uses the Donations of Alexandria as further evidence that Antony is planning to co-opt Rome to install Cleopatra as the Queen of Rome, and to basically turn Rome into a province of Egypt. That Alexandria, this glistening marble city that is far more sophisticated, far more beautiful than Rome, will become the capital city, and Rome will just become a backwater. So clearly meant, on Octavian's part, to instill fear in the people of Rome. Also leading up to this final confrontation between Antony and Octavian is now Antony's divorce of Octavia in 32. So remember that Octavia had returned back to Italy with their children in 37, and that was in some sense the end of the marriage for all intents and purposes, but neither one had pursued a divorce. And so it's not until 32 that Antony does do so, and clearly in an effort again to break ties publicly with Octavian. In response to Antony's move, Octavian does something also ethically suspect, if not illegal, when he seizes Antony's will, which had been deposited with the Vestal Virgins in the Temple of Vesta. These wills are deposited there, they're meant to be kept private. Publicizing Antony's will is really a morally suspect move on Octavian's part, but again is one that is designed to stir up hostility and resentment against Antony, to make the Roman people afraid of what he's going to do. And one of the things that the will contains, supposedly, and whether this was true or not is a matter for debate, but supposedly it sets up his 3 children by Cleopatra as his legitimate heirs, gives them land and money. So again, evidence claims Octavian that Antony is planning to legitimize Cleopatra and their children, and to set them up as rulers in Rome. Octavian also at this point uses the growing resentment and fear of Antony as a time now to declare war. But he's very clever about how he does this. He doesn't declare war against Antony, but rather against Cleopatra. So it's, in other words, a foreign war, not a civil war. And again, very deliberate, and it's meant to remind the Romans that it's Cleopatra that they're supposed to fear, this woman of power. And he plays into all of the stereotypes about women in power and their evil natures. And the Romans, at least sort of on the surface, buy into this. He also requires that all citizens in the West swear an oath of loyalty to him. So, in other words, seeing that the empire has been divided west and east with Octavian in the west, he wants to make sure that nobody goes over to Antony's side. And Antony still had plenty of pockets of support in Italy, in Gaul. So Octavian is taking that step to try to make sure that the citizens in the West stay loyal to him in the event of a confrontation. In 31, the forces of Antony and Octavian finally meet in battle in Actium in Greece. So once again, we have a civil war being fought in Greece rather than in Italy. And there was a series of events that lead up to this confrontation, but finally the two forces come face to face. And it's a sea battle. Not much happens. Octavian, as we've talked about, is not a great military genius, and neither, frankly, is Agrippa, his right-hand man. And so there's not a whole lot going on. Octavian manages to set up a blockade that keeps Antony's forces from moving out, from sailing out of the blockade. He's got them hemmed in on the point that is Actium. But there's no victory here. Weirdly, though, Antony and Cleopatra, on their ships, so they're on separate ships, they manage to run the blockade, so escape the blockade, and they just take off. And Cleopatra returns immediately to Alexandria. Antony takes a slightly longer route, but both of them head back to Alexandria and completely abandon their fleet to Octavian and all of their soldiers. And this is a very strange move. It's unclear why they didn't retreat and wait out Octavian's forces, perhaps engage in a land battle. So after Actium, there isn't a great battle that happens, but really just Antony and Cleopatra surrendering their fleet to Octavian. The two of them, Antony and Cleopatra, retreat to Alexandria, clearly thinking that they're going to rearm themselves, raise more legions, and deal with Octavian in the future. Octavian, meanwhile, actually pursues them to Alexandria, and this was another great move on his part. He doesn't simply rest on his laurels in Actium. He doesn't return to Italy and await another time to confront them. He actually pursues his advantage immediately and tries to take them on in Alexandria. Antony's fleet deserts him, and this is another sort of stunning move that Antony doesn't anticipate. But his fleet decides that they're going to go over to Octavian. They desert him, and he commits suicide. And there's some talk that the reason he kills himself is that he's heard that Cleopatra has already done so, although the report is in fact false. Cleopatra herself is captured by Octavian's forces when they make land in Alexandria. She's captured. Her life is spared because Octavian wants to return her to Rome and show her off in a triumph. She knows this very well. She isn't going to play no part of this, so she kills herself. And here you have a painting representing the death of Cleopatra. Remember famously that Cleopatra was killed by the bite of an asp. And so you can see on the right hand of Cleopatra the asp that's curled around, and all of her ladies in waiting sort of gasping that she's been killed. Whether this is a true story or not is unclear. She may well have just taken some poison, but it makes for a nice image. The death of Cleopatra is also celebrated by a Roman poet named Horace, who was writing under Octavian when he had become Augustus in the aftermath of Actium. And he writes a number of poems about Cleopatra, talking about sort of the evil Egyptian woman who is scheming to take over Rome. But in this ode, 137, so book 1, poem 37, he gives her some grudging respect for her final stand. And I'll let you read this on your own, but the important thing that I want you to get out of this is the extent to which you see the kind of propaganda that was being stirred up against Cleopatra and by association Antony, talking about, the crazy queen was still scheming with her sickly eunuchs, her pack of perverts, to send the capital, and this was the Capitolium, the kind of center of the Roman Forum where the temple to Jupiter was, to send it crashing and bury the empire. So speaking to the supposed aims of Antony and Cleopatra to destroy Rome, and referring to as kind of the drunken Egyptian, the monster that she is. And then goes on and says, but a heroine's death was her goal. She showed no female shivers at the sight of a sword, and her fast-sailing fleet sought no secret harbor. So in other words, she just went straight back to Alexandria. Her courage was great. She looked on her fallen palace, a smile still on her face, and boldly played with venomous serpents, her flesh drinking their bitter poison. So highly she dared, her mind set on her death. Not for her the enemy ship, the crownless voyage, the role in the grand parade of triumph. She was no weak-kneed woman. So here you see Horace celebrating, in some way, the bravery, the courage of Cleopatra, that she dies like a virtuous Roman. This is a kind of Lucretia moment in some sense. And it's a political death. So she also dies like so many of these men that we've seen, where she refuses to be taken in triumph, refuses to be displayed alive and then killed at the hands of the Romans. And so you see sort of this mix of Horace on the one hand playing into the anti-Cleopatra and Antony propaganda, but then at the end of the poem giving her a kind of respect for the way that she chose to end her life. And here you have some coins. As you can see, the Romans liked to issue coins. Coinage played a large role in propaganda. And these are coins that portray Octavian and Agrippa, and they're celebrating the victory over Alexandria, over Egypt. And so you have the Egyptian crocodile on the bottom. And here's another one, and again the crocodile on the bottom, Octavian on the top, and the phrase Aegypto Copta, Egypt captured. So after Actium, we have now Ptolemy Caesar, or Caesarion, the son of Caesar and Cleopatra, who has survived all of this, is proclaimed Pharaoh of Egypt. So he takes the role of, or the position of his mother. His mother is now dead, so he becomes the leader of Egypt. But once Octavian's forces take control of Egypt, then the first thing they do is murder Ptolemy Caesar. This is done not just because he is a rival in Egypt, but of course also because he is Caesar's natural son. And Octavian understands that he does not want this natural son of Caesar out there alive, where he can always threaten Octavian's grasp on power. Interestingly, Cleopatra's other children by Antony, so she had the twins, a son and a daughter, plus another son. They were quite young at this time, but these children are not killed. They're actually taken back to Rome, and they're raised by Antony's ex-wife Octavia. And I mean, it's a kind of fascinating move that they aren't put to death, and it's not because Octavian is so full of clemency. Children were put to death at times, particularly when they were a threat to a ruler. But it seems that Octavian believes that they can be Romanized. And so he lets his sister actually raise these children of his rival Antony. And in fact, they're married off to various rulers. In the case of one of the daughters, Selene, she's actually married to a king in North Africa. So they do in fact become sort of good old-fashioned Roman citizens, and they never do challenge Octavian's grasp on power. So after Actium, now Octavian in 3130 BC, he's 33 years old. So remember, he was 18 when he first came on the scene. He's now 33 years old. 14 years have elapsed. 14 years of a fairly brutal civil war, as he has pushed himself into the position of sole ruler of the Roman Empire. He has no challengers. He is now in the position that his adoptive father Caesar was in, but has gotten there through slightly different routes, but faces many of the same problems that Caesar did. First and foremost, how is he going to consolidate this power? How is he going to make sure that what was essentially a military victory translates into a civil victory, that he's able to work with the Roman people, that he's able to become the leader of Rome? And how is this going to work side by side with the Republican government that at least in form still exists? How is he going to avoid the fate of Julius Caesar, that he is seen as a tyrant rather than as a good king, as it were? And that's something that Octavian is very concerned about. Perhaps foremost on his plate is the problem of defining his position and defining it in legal terms. He is a commander, but he's really been operating now outside of the triumvirate. The second triumvirate has elapsed. The legal powers that it had are no longer his. He's been operating outside of Roman law up to this point, from about 35 onwards. And so now the problem is, how is he going to define a legal position that allows him to exercise power, and what's that going to look like? Is it going to be within the Republican government that has existed in the past, or will it be some form of new government, perhaps a hybrid of republicanism and some kind of monarchical construction? So these are the problems that face Octavian as he returns from Alexandria to Rome.